Phil, the New York Badass. Baroni was once one of the sport's loudest personalities, a fighter who could knock you out with his fists and then leap onto the cage to shout that he was the best. He was brash, cocky, and unforgettable, the kind of character that made fans cheer and critics shake their heads. In the early 2000s, he became a cult star in both the UFC and Japan's legendary Pride fighting championships, earning fame not only for his explosive power, but also for his wild persona. Yet behind the bravado, the seeds of his downfall were already being planted, and the story of how he went from fan favorite to inmate is as shocking as it is tragic. Phil Baroni's journey began far from the arenas of Las Vegas and Tokyo. Born in Long Island, New York in 1976, he grew up in a tough, blue-collar environment where life was about surviving, competing, and proving yourself. Wrestling became his first escape. At Nassau Community College, Baroni earned a name for himself as a two-time All-American before transferring to Hofstra University and eventually Central Michigan. He had the kind of raw athleticism that turned heads, but what really made him stand out was his personality. Even as an amateur wrestler, Baroni was loud, fiery, and larger than life. He thrived on confrontation, trash talk, and showmanship long before it became a norm in MMA. When mixed martial arts exploded in the late 1990s, Baroni saw his chance. With his wrestling background and heavy hands, he threw himself into fighting with the same recklessness he carried in life. By 2001, he was in the UFC, debuting against Curtis Stout. His pressure and crisp boxing carried him to a unanimous decision win, but it was his next fights that made his name. Against former UFC champion Dave Meny, Baroni delivered one of the most memorable knockouts in early UFC history. In just 18 seconds, he swarmed Meny with a barrage of punches, left him unconscious, and then leapt onto the cage, screaming that he was the best ever. It was a declaration as bold as it was arrogant, but it fit Baroni perfectly. The New York Badass had arrived, and everyone in the sport knew it. That moment turned him into one of the UFC's most marketable stars. But Baroni's appeal stretched far beyond American crowds. He soon signed with Pride Fighting Championships in Japan, where his flashy entrances, brash trash talk, and willingness to put on a show won over fans. The Japanese loved fighters who brought personality into the ring, and Baroni was like a rock star. He scored memorable wins against Ikuhisa Minowa, Ryo Chonin, and Yuki Kondo, proving that he wasn't just hype. He could deliver knockouts on the big stage. Even in losses, he carried himself with the same swagger, and that made him impossible to ignore. But as quickly as his fame rose, the cracks started to show. Baroni had all the talent and charisma to be a top contender, but he lacked the discipline to stay there. He relied heavily on his boxing power, often dismissing the need for strategy or game planning. Training camps were inconsistent. He was known to party hard between fights, to overwork himself in the weight room while neglecting the technical growth the evolving sport demanded. By the mid-2000s, MMA was changing rapidly. Fighters were becoming more well-rounded, bringing in world-class jiu-jitsu, kickboxing, and wrestling. Baroni's one-dimensional style started to get exposed. Losses began piling up. He was beaten by top contenders like Matt Lindland and Evan Tanner, and his record slipped closer to even. Instead of being a rising star, he became known as an exciting fighter who couldn't string wins together when it mattered most. And then came another blow to his career. In 2007, after a fight with Frank Shamrock in Strikeforce, Baroni tested positive for steroids. He was suspended for 6 months, and whatever credibility he had left took a major hit. Fans who once saw him as a brash antihero now started to view him as a cautionary tale. Still, Baroni refused to fade quietly. He bounced from promotion to promotion, fighting anywhere that would have him. Elite XC, Strikeforce, Dream, Bellator, won championship. He kept taking fights, kept selling himself as the New York Badass, but the results were brutal. Loss after loss, knockout after knockout, his body began to pay the price. What once looked like swagger increasingly looked like desperation. A fighter clinging to the spotlight even as it slipped away. Outside the cage, his reputation wasn't much better. He was brash and argumentative, constantly feuding with teammates or defending controversial figures like War Machine, whose own criminal history shocked MMA fans. It painted the picture of a man who couldn't let go of the persona he had built, even as it consumed him. By the late 2010s, Baroni was no longer considered a serious fighter. He was a journeyman, a relic of MMA's wild early days, remembered more for his personality than his actual achievements. But he never stopped calling himself the best. Even when the fights stopped making sense, Baroni never stopped believing in the image he had created. And that's what makes what happened next so tragic. Because for Phil Baroni, the fighter who once strutted into arenas with sunglasses, muscles, and swagger, the next chapter of his life would take him far away from the cage. It would take him to a prison cell in Mexico, facing the most serious charge imaginable. And this time, no knockout punch or wild celebration could save him. On January 1st, 2023, the New York Badass made headlines again, but this time, it wasn't for a comeback fight or an outrageous interview. It was for something darker, something no one could have imagined. Mexican authorities announced they had arrested Phil Baroni in the coastal town of San Pancho, Nayarit. The charge was staggering: aggravated femicide, one of the most serious crimes under Mexican law. According to Baroni's account, his girlfriend had slipped and fallen in the shower. But when investigators entered the hotel room, the scene told a different story. She was found dead, covered in bruises, over 37 separate injuries across her face, arms, and body. The explanation of a simple accident quickly collapsed. Witnesses reported hearing loud shouting from the room earlier that evening. Neighbors claimed Baroni had a history of explosive arguments. The contradictions in his story piled up, and prosecutors built a chilling case. Within days, Baroni was formally charged. For MMA fans around the world, the news was devastating. This wasn't just another fighter caught in a bar fight or arrested for reckless behavior. This was murder. The same man who once jumped on cages to declare himself the best ever was now facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life behind bars in a foreign country. ESPN, CBS, and ABC carried the story. His face appeared on police reports instead of fight posters. The fighter who once strutted under bright lights in Tokyo and Las Vegas was now paraded in handcuffs, his head bowed. He was transferred to the Venustiano Carranza State Prison in Tepic, Mexico, to await trial. At 46 years old, Baroni's future was gone. Mexican femicide laws carry penalties of 30 to 75 years. Even the minimum sentence meant he would likely never see freedom again. For a man who once lived off attention, swagger, and spectacle, prison life was a brutal reality. Overcrowded cells, dangerous conditions, silence. Gone were the microphones, the chants, the flashing cameras. His only audience now was guards and other inmates, many of whom didn't care about his past fame. Friends who had seen his decline weren't surprised. For years, Baroni had shown signs of unraveling. His training had become inconsistent. He spoke with bitterness in interviews, sometimes rambling, sometimes detached. Former teammates mentioned memory lapses, mood swings, and erratic behavior, symptoms often linked to brain trauma and possible CTE. The same fighter once celebrated for his intensity now looked like a man carrying the weight of years of punishment. Photographs taken after his arrest revealed a figure almost unrecognizable from his prime. Bloated, tired, older than his years. The sculpted physique that symbolized the New York Badass was gone, replaced with fragility. The MMA community was split in its reaction. Some remembered Baroni fondly as a teammate, a wild personality who brought energy to every locker room. Others expressed only horror, saying the sport could no longer ignore its darker side. Journalists covered the case soberly, reminding fans this wasn't about sports anymore, but about a woman's life cut short. Fans on social media were stunned. Some in disbelief, others resigned to the fact that the man who had once been their hero had crossed an unforgivable line. The case also tapped into something larger than MMA. In Mexico, femicide is a national crisis, with thousands of women killed every year and very few cases leading to justice. Activists highlighted Baroni's arrest as another example of how women face danger even from partners with fame and money. They demanded that his celebrity status not shield him from accountability, insisting that this case was not about a fighter, but about a victim. Back in the United States, the story fueled debate about what happens to fighters once the spotlight fades. Some argued that years of head trauma, drug use, and the inability to transition to life after fighting left men like Baroni broken and volatile. Others dismissed those arguments, saying that whatever the circumstances, violence of this scale can't be excused. What was undeniable was the tragedy. A woman had lost her life, her family left grieving, while Phil Baroni's own life as he knew it was effectively over. Today, at 49, Phil Baroni is no longer remembered for his wild entrances, his knockouts, or his post-fight bravado. He is remembered for a mugshot, for courtrooms, for the silence of a prison cell. His name, once attached to MMA's wild boom years, is now permanently linked to tragedy. The New York badass, who once screamed that he was the best ever, faces the reality of spending the rest of his days behind bars. His legacy, once colorful, chaotic, and entertaining, has been destroyed by his final act. For fans who grew up cheering his fights, it is a hard truth to face. Highlight reels on YouTube still show him in his prime, ripping through opponents in Pride or pounding his chest in the UFC. But those moments now sit under a shadow that can never be erased. The fighter who once represented the excitement and recklessness of MMA's early years has become a cautionary tale about wasted potential, unchecked behavior, and unforgivable violence. Phil Baroni's story doesn't end in victory. It doesn't end with his hand raised in the cage. It ends in silence, in prison walls, in a legacy shattered. And for a man who lived so loudly, the silence may be the most haunting part of all.